Hey, dude. Have you tried Hey Dude? Hey Dude shoes have an ultra lightweight design and velvety softness that feels like floating on clouds. They slip on so easily, you'll want them every time you leave the house. And just like your phone and your keys, you might occasionally check you're even still wearing them. They're so comfy. Hey Dude shoes. Shoes so comfortable, you'll say, dude! Step into effortless style and try a pair at heydudeshoes.com.
With the $5 meal deal at McDonald's, you pick a McDouble or a McChicken, then get a small fry, a small drink, and a 4-piece McNuggets. That's a lot of McDonald's for not a lot of money.
Price and participation may vary. For a limited time only.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, X, Threads, and Facebook at Red Treehouse Pod. And now you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community for as little as $3 per month and receive exclusive member benefits, including personal shoutouts, early access to episodes, bonus episodes, and more. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. As always, if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Important note, sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. Every now and then, while researching for potential episodes, I come across a story that makes me double take. For the most part, these stories involve some religious aspect. Demonic possession, cults, or black mass. And I've always said religious horror, both fiction and non-fiction, really gets under my skin. A few weeks ago, I found references to a story that piqued my interest. But when I researched further, I could hardly find anything of substance. Instead of throwing up my hands and looking to something else, I let that nagging feeling push me to dig further. And what I found was a horrifying, real-life story from Dublin, Ireland in 1973. A story that reads like an urban legend. Something interesting. From everything I've read and researched, it seems as though people want to forget this crime ever happened. It's not well documented, and not really spoken about, except for one book, The Boy in the Attic by David Malone. Much of the information for today's episode will come from the book, which you can find in the show notes. There may be good reasons why this story isn't so well known. The crime is shocking and horrific. In part, because the victim was 7-year-old John Horgan. In part, because the perpetrator was 16-year-old Lorcan Bale. In part, because the details of the crime are enough to shake even the most steadfast person. And in part, because the crime involved Satanism, ritual sacrifice, and possibly black mass. I'll give another content warning later on, but this episode contains graphic descriptions of physical assault and murder against a child. Listener discretion is advised. In this episode of The Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the disturbing and tragic case of John Horgan, the boy in the attic. What compelled a teenage boy to commit a heinous crime? And was he influenced by the devil? Or did he simply act out a horrifying fantasy? I'll share the story. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. A few months before tragedy struck, Father Con O'Keefe was preparing for his usual 7:30 a.m. Mass at St. Philomena's Catholic Church in Palmerstown, Ireland. For many of Ireland's residents, daily Mass was a typical part of their routine. However, recent data had showed a steady decline in church attendance across the country. Despite this, Father O'Keefe continued to prepare for daily Mass, confident that Sunday morning would have an influx of people in attendance. That morning, Father O'Keefe took his usual route and noticed nothing out of the ordinary. By all appearances, it was going to be a typical Sunday morning. But as he walked past the confessionals, he noticed something unusual. Quote, "The side door to the sacristy was ajar," end quote. An important note. A sacristy is, quote, "a room in the church or attached thereto, where the vestments, church furnishings and the like, sacred vessels, and other treasures are kept, and where the clergy meet and vest for the various ecclesiastical functions," end quote. There'd been a rash of burglaries in recent years, but to that point, St. Philomena's had been spared. Then, as he stepped in the room, Father O'Keefe noticed something that filled him with dread and horror. The following short excerpt is from David Malone's book, The Boy in the Attic. Quote, "The high gilt crucifix, normally the centerpiece of the altar, had been moved. It now lay upside down, in a deliberate and profane mockery, with the head of Jesus pointing to the earth. The altar appeared disheveled, but it was only when he drew closer to the tabernacle that the true extent of the desecration became clear. The small wooden door of the tabernacle box was ajar, and Father O'Keefe could now see what had been taken. The silver communion chalice was missing, but worse, so were 3 Holy Eucharist wafers. The very host itself, that when consecrated, would become the actual body of Christ, had been stolen." End quote. For 16-year-old Lorcan Bale, June 14, 1973, started out somewhat differently than most other mornings. His mother recently had a hysterectomy after experiencing months of stomach cramps. Though she would typically be at home with her husband Kenneth and their children, this day she was recovering at a nearby hospital. Lorcan was preparing for his intermediate certificate exams and was stressed that he would not do well in geography, which he considered his weakest subject. Mr. Bale, for his part, cared deeply about his children's academic performance, and, quote, had gone so far as to install a shed in the back garden of his home, where he would individually tutor his children in preparation for their upcoming exams." End quote. Despite studying hard for his exams, Lorcan felt like he would fail, save for some random act of God, or maybe someone else. For 7-year-old John Horgan, June 14th, 1973, was somewhat exciting, as the start of summer break was just a few days away, and a few weeks earlier, he'd celebrated a significant milestone, his first Holy Communion, which is, quote, a rite of passage where he received his first sacrament of the Holy Eucharist, end quote. That day, his mother went to visit Mrs. Bale in the hospital, leaving John in the care of the Bale family, including Lorcan. As she prepared to leave for the hospital, Mrs. Horgan, quote, lifted John over the low wall separating the Horgan and Bale back gardens, handing her son over to the kindly Bale grandmother, Mrs. Ann Breslin, end quote. You heard that right. John Horgan and Lorcan Bale were neighbors. As John settled into the Bale home, he spent time on the back porch, enraptured by the family's pet canary. A short time later, Lorcan walked out to the area where John was sitting and, quote, asked if he would like to look for rabbits in the field behind the house, end quote. John agreed, and within a few seconds, the two climbed the back fence and wandered into a large field behind the row houses. Before we continue, it's important to give a content warning. The following contains graphic descriptions of physical assault and murder against a young child. Listener discretion is advised. As the two walked further into the field and out of view of the houses, they eventually came to a small hedge where Lorcan had previously caught rats. He pointed out a rat hole and encouraged John to look further, as he might be able to spot a rabbit. John stooped low to try and catch a glimpse. At that time, Lorcan placed a large sack on the grass behind John and pulled a wooden club from his pocket. Then, he clubbed John in the back of the head, killing him instantly. David Malone offers greater detail, stating, quote, the only mercy in this vicious act was that John could not have seen or felt the impending attack. And when it came, according to the autopsy report, his brain injuries were so severe that death would have swiftly followed the blow. In short, John Horgan's life was cruelly extinguished, but it is unlikely he ever felt any pain. End quote. An Irish Times article dated May 25, 2011, stated, quote, state pathologist at the time, Dr. Maurice Hickey, found the boy died from a fracture of the skull and bruising and laceration of the brain as a result of severe blunt force injury or injuries to the back of the head, end quote. As John lay dead at his feet, Lorcan proceeded to tie his hands and legs and placed a gag in his mouth. Then, he put John in the large sack and walked back towards his house, carrying the sack in his arms. While walking home, Lorcan passed two boys and signaled for them to keep away. Then, with the boys out of sight, he placed the body of John Horgan in a hedge. He moved quickly to find a larger bag, as the sack containing John's body was too small. finding a large backpack, he placed John inside and proceeded to move quietly to his home, where he walked inside and went upstairs to his bedroom. A short time later, Lorcan went downstairs to make himself a cup of tea, during which his grandmother asked if he'd seen John Horgan, as she'd last seen the two together walking towards the field. Lorcan replied John was likely still out in the field, playing with some of the other children who were back there. It didn't take long for Lorcan's grandmother to sound the alarm, and within minutes, the neighborhood was out in full force, looking for John Horgan. A chilling reality. Lorcan Bale joined in the search for John Horgan, feigning ignorance about the whereabouts of the young boy, despite knowing what he'd done. As the search intensified, Lorcan slipped away to his bedroom, and by 8 p.m. that evening, just 4 hours or so after he'd killed John Horgan, it was established that Lorcan was the last person to see him alive. Realizing this, Mr. Horgan demanded Lorcan tell him where John was. But Lorcan, once again, feigned ignorance and told him John must have wandered off while he was studying for his upcoming exams. Eventually, local police were called to search the area, where they spoke with Lorcan and his father Kenneth. In that conversation, Lorcan acknowledged being the last person to see John Horgan alive, but stated that John must have gone off while he was studying. Unconvinced, Detective Sergeant Jim Noonan spoke privately with Lorcan's father, who explained his son had recently been having behavioral issues, was lashing out at his family, and had questioned the family's Catholic faith and values. Perhaps sensing they were close to an answer, Detective Noonan pleaded with Lorcan for more information, reminding him that if John were hurt somewhere, time would be critical in administering aid. Lorcan remained silent. Then, another detective said aloud, "We'll search the house." After a few seconds, Lorcan spoke up. "I'll show you." In the attic. After carrying the sack containing John's body to his bedroom, Lorcan placed it on his bed and went outside to grab a ladder, which he then placed inside his wardrobe on the edge of a trap door leading to the attic. It is possible that Lorcan was the only one who knew about this doorway, as he'd not told anyone, and it was not a main entrance into the attic itself. Over the course of several minutes, Lorcan pulled the sack into the attic, resulting in bruising to John Horgan's body. Once inside, Lorcan removed John from the sack and placed his body along the floor joists and cut the ties on John's hands and legs. Then, quote, he took a thick red rope previously placed in the attic and tied the body to a vertical beam that ran from the roof to the attic floor. With the abdomen and feet secure in an apparent standing position, he tied the hands outstretched. End quote. Lorcan Bale raised John Horgan's body to the rafters of the attic and tied his hands so they were outstretched on both sides, with his feet pointing to the earth. Lorcan Bale crucified John Horgan. A few hours later, when Lorcan led detectives to the attic, they were horrified at the scene in front of them. The position of John's body was sacrilegious. But as they processed the scene, they noticed other chilling details. Lorcan had placed candles, 3 communion hosts, a box of human feces, and the communion chalice, stolen months before from St. Philomena Catholic Church, underneath the body of John Horgan. Lorcan Bale built an altar and performed a black mass. Lorcan was quickly arrested and charged with John Horgan's murder. Under Irish law, he was tried as an adult, as he was over the age of 12 and was past the age of criminal responsibility. But this was a unique situation, because though he was tried as an adult, Irish law prohibited the disclosure of a juvenile's identity. So no one knew, with exception of those directly involved in the case, that he was responsible for John's murder. Despite this, rumors spread about the occult nature of the crime, including the crucifixion of John Horgan. And though journalists salivated over covering such a sensational crime, they were disappointed when Lorcan Bale issued a guilty plea, ending the trial immediately. Lorcan Bale was sentenced to life in prison, but was released in 1980, after serving only 7 years. As of 2011, he was living a quiet life in England, and was active in his local Anglican church. The story doesn't end there. In the 50 years since John Horgan was murdered, several peculiarities have surfaced. On June 16, 1973, 2 days after the murder, a death notice for John Horgan was published in the Irish Independent, listing the cause of death as an accident. For one reason or another, and theories abound, the details of John Horgan's death went largely unreported. And strangely, a formal death certificate for John Horgan was not issued until 2011, 38 years later, following the reopening of an inquest into the details of his murder. By the time John Horgan's body was pulled down from the rafters of the Bale house, it was obvious Lorcan Bale was a self-professed Satanist and obsessed with the occult. By some accounts, he enjoyed capturing, torturing, and killing small animals around the neighborhood. Lorcan Bale also had a list of 10 children he planned to sacrifice to Satan. One of those was John Horgan. An undated article by Naomi McElroy stated, quote, "Bale stole from churches and robbed graves to make his macabre satanic altar. He had all the artifacts he had stolen from the Catholic Church: the chalice, the host. He had gone into a graveyard and dug up bones. But most chilling of all, I drove down to Lucan, and the detective said, 'He's in there, and it's quite extraordinary. He's talking about his failure.' Lorcan Bale was in there, and in his hysteria he was talking disjointedly to a master we now know as the Dark Lord about his failure, how he had failed. His diabolical plan was in the list that was found down by the river where he clubbed that young John Horgan to death, was a list of victims. If he had his way, he would have become a serial killer, a diabolical killer." End quote. I'll admit, this case really bothers me, and has stuck with me since I first discovered it. And I can't pinpoint one specific detail that doesn't bug me. The victim, the perpetrator, the murder, the religious and occult nature of the crime, the light prison sentence, the hush-hush response. It's all disturbing in the worst ways. And while some will cry cover-up, I wonder if there are some events so traumatic, it's simply easier to block it out and pretend it didn't happen. The story reads and sounds like an urban legend. And, for a time, Lorcan Bale was a type of boogeyman character in Palmerstown. But, no matter how hard we try, we cannot escape the harsh and tragic reality that a teenage boy brutally murdered a young child in the name of Satan. In this case, at least, the urban legend was 100% truth. And the evil monster wasn't Satan, but a teenager named Lorcan Bale. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with these lingering questions. What compelled a teenage boy to commit a heinous crime against a young child? Was he influenced by the devil? Or did he simply act out a horrifying fantasy? I've shared the story. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.